Her heart raced as she watched him, his movements stiff and unnatural. The lie hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't look away from the small, shiny object in his pocket. It was too small to be harmless. Her voice shook as she tried to stay calm. "What is it really?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. He took a step forward, trying to bridge the distance between them, but she pulled back inside herself, suspicion growing inside her. He sighed, rubbing his hand through his hair in frustration. "It's a gift. For a client?" His words were defensive, and his eyes kept darting to the door, like he wanted to leave. But she wasn't fooled. She had spent so many nights wondering if things were wrong between them. She had felt the distance, and now, this object in his pocket felt like the final sign that something was terribly off. "Give it to me," she said, her voice firm. She needed to know. She had to. He hesitated, but her gaze stayed strong, her fists clenched. Finally, he pulled it out of his pocket and handed it to her, clearly reluctant. It was a small, elegant box, not what you would expect for a business gift. Her fingers shook as she opened it. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, detailed and beautiful. And most shocking of all, it wasn't something for a client. She lifted it carefully, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized the symbol engraved on the inside. It was the same symbol she had seen on a piece of jewelry in a boutique. Something exclusive, something she could never afford. The blood drained from her face. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice breaking. Her husband's face twisted, and he closed his eyes, not able to meet her gaze. The silence stretched, heavy with all the things they hadn't said. I didn't want you to find out like this," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "But there's someone else." Her chest tightened. She hadn't imagined it. The distance, the coldness, the lies, they had all pointed to this moment. Deep down, she had known something was wrong. But hearing it aloud felt like the ground beneath her had fallen away. "How long?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Months," he admitted, his voice low and filled with guilt. "I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did." She could hardly breathe. Months. All this time she had been living with a lie, sharing her life with a man who was no longer hers. The pain hit her like a sharp, deep cut. In the silence that followed, she heard the soft rustling of the orchid's dying petals, a symbol of everything that had fallen apart between them. Everything she had tried to keep alive, to protect, had been for nothing. "I never asked for this," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she turned away, the truth heavy in her chest. "But I won't let you keep lying to me." Her husband's footsteps followed her as she moved to the window. The space between them now, too wide to fix. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice shaking. She didn't look at him. She stared out at the city below, her reflection in the glass, a ghost of the woman she had once been. "I want the truth," she said softly. "Tai, and I want you to leave." Her words hung in the air, not out of anger, but because she had realized she deserved more than a man who had already chosen someone else. He didn't argue, he didn't beg. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before she heard the door quietly click shut behind him. The apartment felt colder that evening, the silence heavier than usual. The old orchid by the window stood as a reminder of the slow decay in her life. She stared at it for a long time, watching the wilted petals curl in on themselves. The sight of it, once vibrant and full of life, seemed to mirror her feelings. The shadow of her fading marriage loomed, and she couldn't shake the sinking feeling in her chest. Her husband's words from earlier kept echoing in her mind. Just something for work. The lie was obvious now. She couldn't ignore the guilt she had seen flicker in his eyes when she asked about the small object he had hidden. His hesitation, the way he shielded it as though it were something too important to reveal. But what troubled her more than the lie was the growing emotional distance between them. There was no tenderness anymore. No quiet moments shared at the end of the day. They no longer laughed together over meals or spent time enjoying each other's company. Everything had become routine. His work, her jobs, the increasing silence between them. The warmth that used to fill their home had turned into hollow words, small talk that neither of them really believed in anymore. Doubts started to creep into her mind, coming at the strangest times. She tried to push it away, focusing on the work that kept her busy. But the more she worked, the more the feeling of being unnoticed gnawed at her. She had noticed the small changes: the way he stopped coming home on time, the late nights spent away, the strange phone calls that were always cut off when she walked into the room. Her mind raced as she thought about everything that had seemed insignificant before but now felt like signs of something bigger. The sudden indifference toward their life together, his absences growing more frequent, the preoccupation in his eyes. She couldn't ignore it anymore. It was as if their life was slipping away piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the broken parts of their marriage. That night, as she sat alone in the dimly lit apartment, exhaustion washing over her. Like a heavy blanket, one thought struck her hard. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She needed answers. She needed the truth. Her heart raced as she made a decision. She would follow him. Wherever he went tonight, she would go with him and find out for herself what he was hiding. It was risky, and it could break what little was left between them. But she couldn't stay in the dark any longer. She couldn't be a passive observer in her own life. When the clock struck midnight, she heard the familiar sound of the front door opening. His shoes clipped softly on the floor as he moved through the apartment. He didn't notice her sitting there in the shadows, her face hidden from his view. He moved quickly, heading for the coat rack. She could hear the rustle of his jacket as he prepared to leave. Her pulse quickened. This was it. Her breath caught as she stood up, moving toward him in the hallway. Her footsteps were quiet but deliberate as she approached him. He froze when he saw her, his hand still on the coat but his eyes widened in surprise. He tried to mask his shock with forced calmness. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice strained. Casual but not convincing. Her eyes locked onto his, and she stood her ground. "Where are you going?" Her voice was steady now, no longer filled with doubt. There was no fear left in her, only resolve. He hesitated, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Finally, he exhaled and ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "It's nothing. I have a meeting. Don't worry about it." She shook her head, the silence stretching between them. She had seen enough. The look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't telling her the truth, and the way he couldn't meet her gaze, it confirmed her suspicions. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. The words surprised even her. She had never confronted him like this before. Never. Taken control of the situation. His face flickered with panic for a moment, but then he sighed, shoulders slumping. "Fine," he muttered, defeated. "Come with me." They left together, the cold night air biting at her skin as they walked through the streets. Every step felt like a step toward the unknown. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as she followed him. But there was no turning back now. They stopped in front of a small jewelry store. Her heart skipped a beat. "What are we doing here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her husband looked at her frustration and fear in his eyes. "I'll explain later," he said quietly, but she could tell he was hiding something. Without another word, she followed him inside. The dim lights and shadows in the store made her heart race even faster. The truth was close now. She could feel it. As she sat on the edge of their bed, a bitter taste of exhaustion lingered in her mouth. The weight of the day, the weight of everything, felt too much to bear. She couldn't help but wonder as her gaze fixed on the empty space next to her. Where? It all went wrong. Seemed like only yesterday they were full of dreams, sharing everything, every moment. Now, all of it felt so distant, like a different lifetime. She had loved him with everything she had, heart, soul, and mind. She had sacrificed so much for their life together, for their future. But where had that love gone? Slowly, imperceptibly, it had transformed into something far colder, something unrecognizable: indifference. The emptiness between them was overwhelming. And now distress had crept in, silently consuming her peace of mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something she couldn't yet put her finger on, but knew deep down to be true. Her fingers brushed against the wilted petals of the orchid, once vibrant and full of life. It was now nothing more than a reminder of her own fading hopes, her own unnoticed struggles. The flower's lifelessness mirrored her feelings, slowly wilting, quietly forgotten. She hadn't even realized that a tear had slipped from her eye until it landed softly on the fragile petals. She wiped it away quickly, ashamed of the weakness it revealed. But the truth was, she was exhausted, physically and emotionally. Everything she had poured into this marriage, into their life, seemed to be unraveling in front of her eyes. The tears were silent, just like everything in her life. She never shouted, never let her hurt show. She had learned to bottle it all up, to keep going, to keep working, to keep pretending that everything was fine. She kept the house together, made dinner, smiled at him as he came home late, all the while feeling her soul quietly breaking. No one saw it. No one understood the heaviness of the silence between them. It was easier to pretend, easier to ignore. The truth that was slowly poisoning their relationship. But tonight, she decided that enough was enough. She couldn't keep pretending any longer. Tonight, she would find out the truth. No more guessing, no more wondering in the dark. She needed answers, even if those answers would break her heart. The decision was made in an instant. A moment of clarity cutting through the fog of doubt, as her husband began preparing to leave for the night. She stood up quietly, slipping on her coat. There was no hesitation now, no lingering fears. She was done with the lies, done with pretending everything was fine. Tonight, she would confront the truth, whatever it was. Without a word, she followed him, her steps soft but determined. It felt almost surreal, as if she were moving in a dream. Her thoughts were racing, her mind filled with questions, but she couldn't allow herself to think too much. She simply had to know where he was going and why. The streets outside were cold, the usual buzz of the city drifting around her. People rushed by, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding in the shadows. But to her, it felt like everything around her had come to a standstill. The world for a moment was irrelevant. All that mattered was the man ahead of her, her husband, and the truth she was about to uncover. She kept a careful distance, staying far enough back so that he wouldn't notice her presence, yet close enough to follow his every move. Her heart pounded in her chest, a heavy drumbeat that matched the rhythm of her footsteps. The further they went, the more the uncertainty gnawed at her. But she was resolute. She couldn't go on living in ignorance any longer. Tonight, she would finally have the answers. They stopped in front of a small, inconspicuous jewelry store. Nothing special, nothing that stood out. It was a place she had passed by countless times before without ever sparing it a second thought. But now everything felt different. Her gaze fixed on the shop, a strange unease settling in her stomach. She watched as her husband entered the store. His back turned to her as he disappeared through the door. She didn't move right away. She stood across the street, her body frozen in place. Her breath, shallow and shaky, formed small clouds in the chilly night air. She could feel the weight of the decision she had just made pressing down on her. Everything she had feared, everything she had doubted, was now coming to a head. Then it happened. She saw the woman. Her heart skipped a beat. The woman was standing inside the store, her hand resting on her husband's arm too familiarly, too intimately. The way she touched him, the way she smiled at him, it was all wrong. The intimacy between them was undeniable. Her chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. The world around her seemed to blur as her eyes locked on the scene inside. The betrayal was clear now, too clear to ignore. It was as though the ground beneath her feet had crumbled away. She had known something was off, had suspected it for weeks, but this was the confirmation she never wanted. Her heart shattered, the sound of it breaking louder than anything around her. The tears came, hot and uncontrollable, blurring her vision. She turned away quickly, desperate to escape the pain, desperate to hide from the reality that had just been thrust into her life. She couldn't stay there, couldn't watch any longer. She needed to leave, to get away from the crushing weight of the truth that had just destroyed everything she had once known. Her steps were shaky as she walked away, the cold night air biting at her skin, but she didn't care. She had already lost him, the life she had built with him, the future they had shared was gone. And now all she could do was face the aftermath. The night felt like a heavy cloak, pressing down on her as she walked home, her thoughts clouded with the discovery she had just made. Every step felt harder, each one weighted by the pain of betrayal. The realization that her husband had been unfaithful had crushed her, shattered the illusion she had been holding on to. She had given everything to this marriage, her time, her energy, her love. She had worked herself to exhaustion, always hoping that things would get better, that he would come back to her. But now she knew the truth. Her world had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. And she couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. She couldn't keep pretending to be the dutiful wife, unaware of what was happening right under her nose. The silence and the distance between them had been too much, and she had finally seen the reality of it all. She wasn't going to let herself be a victim anymore. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, she made a decision. It was time to take control, to stop being the passive observer in her own life. She wasn't going to let her husband continue his deception. And she wasn't going to wallow in self-pity any longer. She had done enough of that. With newfound resolve, she walked to the jewelry store. The familiar bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. And she made her way to the counter with a steady, purposeful stride. The woman behind the counter looked up, her face lighting up in a polite smile. But there was something more in her gaze, a knowing look. As if she recognized the change in her. The woman felt a surge of power in that moment. Something that had been missing for far too long. She was no longer the passive wife, the one who silently accepted the lies. Now, she was taking charge of her own destiny. And the air around her seemed to shift. "I want to sell this," she said, her voice calm but firm. She pulled out the ring, the one that her husband had bought for the other woman, the one that had been hidden from her, the one that had confirmed everything she had suspected. The woman behind the counter didn't question her. She didn't ask why or how. She simply nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. She took the ring and placed it on the counter, her fingers brushing against it briefly before she slid it into a velvet pouch, as the transaction was completed. The woman could feel the weight lift from her shoulders, with the ring in her hand. She left the store, walking out into the world with a new sense of strength and purpose. She had taken the first step in reclaiming her life, in finding her own power once more. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. She wasn't defined by her husband's betrayal. She wasn't defined by his lies. She was defined by herself, and that was all that mattered. The cold air wrapped around her as she walked away, but it no longer felt suffocating. She wasn't the same woman who had entered that store just minutes before. She was someone new, someone who had taken back control of her life. And in that moment, she knew everything would be different from now on. When he came home that evening, the air between them was thick with the unspoken. He didn't need to say a word. His silence was enough. She didn't need his excuses, his apologies, or his explanations. The lies had already been laid bare, and there was no going back. She had made up her mind. No longer was she the woman who silently bore the weight of betrayal. The one who had been willing to overlook the cracks in their marriage. She had been that woman, silent, patient, and giving. But she was not her anymore. She was done hiding her pain. Done pretending that everything was okay when she had been slowly losing herself. She packed her bags that night, gathering only the essentials, the clothes, the little things that mattered most. But she didn't pack away the orchid. It was the only thing that felt right to take. The once wilting flower, which had mirrored her feelings of neglect and decay, had slowly started to bloom again in the last few days. It was a symbol of her own transformation, her new beginning. She wasn't leaving with a broken spirit anymore. She was leaving with a sense of purpose. Her husband watched in silence, a distant look in his eyes. There was no plea for her to stay, no regret in his gaze. He had lost her and he knew it. But she wasn't looking for his approval. She wasn't waiting for his words to validate her decision. The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that echoed in her mind. She had walked away as she stepped outside. The chill of the night air met her skin, but it didn't feel cold anymore. The weight that had once hung over her shoulders had been lifted. She had taken back control of her life. She wasn't the woman who had cried in silence anymore. She was someone stronger, someone who had found her voice, her power. The orchid, now vibrant and full of life, rested in her arms. It was no longer a symbol of fading hope. It had become a symbol of her rebirth. As she walked away from the life that had once defined her, she knew that her journey was just beginning.